Well, good evening and welcome. From the Boston Public Library and our partners at the Cary Memorial Library and the MIT Office of Religious Spiritual Life, we're glad that you're here joining us this evening. Our featured author and conversation partner this evening will join us in just a moment, but first, a few items of housekeeping before we get started. Subtitles and closed captioning can be turned on or off at the bottom of your screen by the CC button or the live transcript button. So you can either turn that on or off. You can ask questions at any time during the program. Also on the bottom of your screen, there's a Q&A button. So if you could just click on that and you can type in your question at any time. We have reserved some time toward the end to answer your questions. To buy a signed copy of tonight's book, you can please visit our bookstore partner, Porter Square Books, and use code BPL-EVENT23 for a signed copy of At Home on an Unruly Planet, or check your local library. Now, just a little bit of information about our featured author and guest moderator. Madeline Ostrander is a science journalist. Her reporting on climate change has taken her to locations such as the Alaskan Arctic and the Australian outback. Her book, At Home on an Unruly Planet, Finding Refuge on a Changed Earth, was named one of Kirkus Review's 100 Best Nonfiction Books of 2022. Congratulations, Madeline. She holds a master's degree in environmental science from the University of Wisconsin at Madison. We'll meet Madeline in just a moment. Her conversation partner this evening is Greg N. Epstein. Greg serves as the Humanist chaplain at both Harvard University and MIT, where he is a convener for ethical life at the MIT Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life. First, Madeline, why don't you join us, tell us a little bit about the book, and maybe start us off with a reading. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Kristen, and thanks to Boston Public Library. And I'm just really excited to be here with everybody tonight. So I'll read you a little sort of abridged piece of chapter 3, which is about St. Augustine, Florida. And the reason I chose it is because St. Augustine has some things in common with Boston. It's both a very historic city, one of the most historic cities in the country, and they're facing a lot of risks from flooding. And just to give a little context about the book, the book is reflecting on what it means to live in this moment where we're all facing new kinds of risks at home. And what does it mean to have a home now and to live in a community? Just for a little bit of statistics, in 2021 alone, more than 4 in 10 Americans lived in counties affected by climate-related disasters, and a huge percentage of the country was facing heat wave this summer. And I think, you know, it's easy to sometimes when we're not in the middle of that disaster, it's easy to forget that they're coming again, and that, you know, that everywhere in the country is being affected by these. But I think we all are facing these risks. And so the book is telling stories of people who are looking for solutions for how we live in this moment, both these new threats and how we make the kinds of transitions that we need to make to manage the climate crisis and to hopefully get ourselves out of crisis. So here's a little bit of that. This is a person named Jenny Wolf. In 2011, when Jenny Wolf was hired as the Historic Preservation Officer of the city of St. Augustine, a burg of 15,000 people on Florida's northeast coast, she didn't think she would be planning for floods and storms. It was an overwhelming but rewarding job, and she would grow to love this storied place. Established in the 16th century by the Spanish, St. Augustine is the oldest continuously occupied European settled city in the United States, sometimes nicknamed the Ancient City. Her new desk stood inside City Hall, which shares space with a quirky museum of antiquities and high art inside the old 19th century Alcazar Hotel, a Spanish Renaissance revival building capped with ornately carved terracotta and brick towers, like a reverse red velvet layer cake. A block away lies the old Spanish plaza, laid out in 1573, with archaeological finds now interred beneath almost every bench and lamppost. And from there, the historic details spread out in all directions like chapters in an epic. Jenny moved to St. Augustine during a spate of calm weather. For a handful of years, there were no major storms. She moved alone to an apartment in a neighborhood called Davis Shores. It had been platted in the 1920s on Anastasia Island, a barrier island across the river from the city center, and built up during a series of mid-20th century real estate booms. Jenny's place was a 1940s garage that had been transformed into a cottage. It was dainty and mint green with a metal roof, its inner walls covered in heart pine tongue and groove paneling. She dearly loved this place, a space of her own. She planted 3 raised garden beds full of vegetables and adopted a puppy. But Davis Shores is low-lying and susceptible to regular soaking by the tides. Already, even on a sunny day, a high tide could send water from the estuary into the creeks, to the storm drains, to the streets, dampening the underbellies of the cars parked there. St. Augustine's sea level rise report came back from the state of Florida and NOAA in June 2016 and offered an alarming prognosis for the city. With 1.5 feet of sea level rise, nearly a third of the city's road network would frequently be swamped by the highest high tides and storms, and a fifth to half of the buildings and structures in the downtown historic district would flood around once a month or more. The scenario could be reality as soon as the 2040s, according to the report. By about 2.5 feet, the city would have passed a tipping point. 24 times as many buildings would be vulnerable to tidal flooding every day. This could happen as soon as the 2050s if global society kept gasping out carbon rapidly. Then, in late September 2016, as if to illustrate how powerful and raucous water and wind could be, Hurricane Matthew rose up from the Caribbean. It never made landfall in Florida, striking South Carolina instead. St. Augustine could be considered, in the grand scheme of things, lucky. But even good luck in a hurricane can still look rough. On Saturday, Jenny drove her car back into the city under a jarringly blue sky. I was driving through, I don't want to say a war zone, she said, but it felt like you're going to the site of devastation. Downed fences, fallen trees and debris, signs wrenched off posts, Halloween pumpkins transported by floodwaters, heaped on the street. Jenny crossed the Bridge of Lions, built in 1926 and adorned with actual marble lions, to her own neighborhood. When she arrived at her apartment, she saw that Matthew had, sorry, there's this mistake here. In my abridged version, she saw that Matthew had dumped miscellaneous belongings from the yards and storage units nearby and strewn the alley in front with garments, outdoor furniture, and bicycles. The floodwaters had soaked the rooms inside her place, ruining her old wedding album, shoes, kitchen appliances, a dresser full of clothes, thumb drives, and various other personal effects she'd left there. Her place emitted a powerful odor that she would remember vividly, but never be able to describe, stranger and more potent than sewage. After sizing up the mess, she donned rubber boots and gloves to salvage what she could of her home. In the next few weeks, she would turn her attention to the rest of the city, to help other St. Augustinians recover, to try to protect the place from the next flood. The storm wasn't as bad as it might have been, but it carried a more powerful symbolism than some of the hurricanes before it. It was a moment of foreshadowing that would force tough questions about the city's future and what everyone living there would do when the water arrived and again at their doorsteps. Jenny would put her efforts toward helping the city she loved stay safe for as long as possible.
Well, may I join the conversation then?
Yes. Hi, Greg. So yeah, Greg and I were going to have a little talk about communities and climate change and ethics. And
Love hearing you read, Madeline. It's these stories, people say they resonate with me, right? But what I mean if I say that is it's like I really feel as I hear you read these stories that you've spent so many years lovingly crafting, they're in tune with these worries that I'm just carrying with me almost every minute of the day these days, as I begin to think about my world in a new way. And I'm just so delighted to see the book being recognized now. Now that it's on lists like Kyrgyz's list, and people are having events like this all over the country, because each time I would read something in the book in 2022, and now I'm reading it again in 2023, I would note, okay, here she is, basically a decade ago, thinking about what an audience today would need to hear, and the details that the audience just heard: the ancient city, the mint green, the paneling, the low-lying, the flood once a month or more. Even good luck in a hurricane could be considered rough, right? Your sentences are like that throughout the book. There's just enough detail that we're absolutely right there with you, and not a bit too much either. So with not a bit too much, I'll turn it back to you. Not a bit too much, I'll turn it back to you and just say, how are you finding, now that you've been sort of traveling around the country virtually and a bit physically as well, how are you finding this story that you've crafted over this amount of time to be resonating with people who really are afraid, and they find fear in your book, that you raise the stakes for them, or you show the stakes, but you also offer hope? What kinds of emotional responses are you getting from your readers based on that dichotomy?
I think people are already feeling the fear. I don't think that my book is bringing them extra fear. I think that what I hope and what I feel from people when I have events is that they're already feeling these emotions. And the book talks a lot about the emotional territory of the climate crisis as well. They're already feeling this, and the book lets them feel, one, that they're not alone, two, that we're not just hapless victims in this crisis. There's a lot of work being done, and a lot of work that can be done on adaptation and resilience, and on how we cope with these new situations. And of course, there's a huge amount of work being done all across the country, activist work and work on renewable energy to transform our economy. And that just keeps speeding up over time. I mean, it's not yet enough, but it's growing. And so I think the book helps people contextualize how they're feeling, and I hope feel like they have some power in places that they live, in contexts that are meaningful to them, to do something.
Yeah, I mean, I think you do give people a sense of empowerment, even throughout the fear that we're feeling. That it's sort of it. Anxiety is when you see a picture of a snake and you go into a panic mode, right? But fear is when you encounter a snake in your path. It's a natural response, and it gives you the strength to run. Do what you need to do. And I think that this is not anxiety. This is not a drill. You write about fear. But you write about these beautiful responses to fear. I would love to talk a little bit about the response in Richmond, California. But maybe let's talk about the structure of the book, though. Why don't you give people a sense of why you told these 4 stories that you told, And I'll say, I love the fact that you asked me, a non-religious chaplain, to be in dialogue with you, because there's this biblical quality, right? You have these 4 stories. They begin the fire, the flood, the thaw, and then the explosion. And of course, the first 2, the fire and the flood, those refer to tragedies that one could imagine being biblical. In fact, there is, the idea of a flood is an important part of the Bible. But the thaw, you don't have a thaw in the Bible, and you certainly don't have an oil rig explosion in the Bible. But these are sort of new biblical moments, new sacred moments for all of us. So talk about the structure. Why did you decide to structure it this way? How hard was it to create that kind of structure? And then talk about the essays about home, which are just so beautiful and brilliant, and they break up the chapters in the most lovely way. It's really one of my favorite nonfiction books that I've read in a long time.
Oh, well, thank you, Greg. So the book has these 4 stories, and I focused on 4 because I wanted people to be able to identify with the book. I wanted it to be representative of different kinds of communities and different kinds of aspects of climate change that people are facing at home. But I also wanted to be able to go deep. So I wanted you to be able to get to know some of the people like Jenny Wolfe and others whose stories appear in the book. And the book has a sort of Act 1 and Act 2. So in part 1 of the book, the community, or the characters, they're real humans, but the people whose stories I follow realize they're in a new world, which in a lot of ways is the basic hero's journey, right? We all of our stories come back to this idea that we're encountering a new world, we're encountering something troubling or difficult, or that we have to navigate that's different. And now in this moment in human experience, we're all living on a new planet, basically. I mean, we're living in new conditions that we haven't dealt with before, and that's difficult and can be scary. And I wanted to follow the stories of people who were reckoning with that in a way that was proactive. And so in the second half of the book, the people that I'm following and the communities that they live in start searching for solutions and start identifying ways that they can cope with these kind of experiences. And there's the 4 stories. 3 of them are a lot about the impacts of climate change, although we're dealing with all of these things at once. We're dealing with the impacts, and we're dealing with how to make these big economic transitions. But the 4th story, as Greg alluded to, starts in part 1 with a fire at a massive oil refinery in California, and is all about the community reimagining itself to move beyond oil. And so it puts you in touch with, in a sense, the disaster that is also our oil economy, which is also, of course, or our fossil fuel economy, which is also, of course, powering the larger disaster of the climate crisis. And how do we confront that in our lives?
And then you mix in these essays that define the concept of home, and you really, it's almost a dissertation on the nature of what it is to be at home. It also sort of reminds me of the famous Joni Mitchell song, don't it always seem to go that you don't know what you've got till it's gone, right? That you literally know what you've got when you read your book. In terms of a home, you start in the second chapter, meaning the first essay on home, with the idea of nostalgia and its origins, and the idea that it's a kind of suffering or grief. Talk about that. I mean, the suffering and the grief. There is a certain way in which you are people's clergy as you walk them through this narrative as well.
That's an interesting idea. I think I wanted to give people some space to deal with the emotional aspects of the climate crisis in the book, because it's heavy, it's hard. a large number, especially of young people, are dealing with eco-anxiety and with a lot of worries and concerns and like really substantial emotional health concerns about the climate crisis. And I think we need to recognize that this is also a philosophical and emotional and a personal moment, that we're being affected on a personal level by this crisis. And how do we deal with that? In the chapter that you're talking about, I refer to the work of an Australian philosopher who says that we're going through also a crisis of a kind of homesickness. So the places that are familiar to us are changing around us in ways that make it harder for us to feel safe, harder for us to relate to them. And that's part of the stakes. And it's also part of what we need to really build resilience to, is to, continue to renew ourselves and kind of find ways to cope with these things. In my own area of the country, I'm talking to you all from Seattle, Washington right now. We've been dealing with new major heat waves that we've never dealt with before. This is a temperate climate, and a lot of people aren't really adapted to them, in the sense that we don't have things like air conditioning in our houses. But on top of that, it's very unsettling and stressful to be dealing with major heat waves and wildfires in a place that you're not accustomed to dealing with those. And I think it's important to recognize that piece of it, because it's part of our experience.
I wanted to say a bit about how you and I got connected for this project. I have been following you since about 2016. You published an article in The Nation, right, that was about the idea of the Conceivable Future Project and the related story of women who were so concerned about the future of the climate that they weren't sure, you weren't sure at the time. It was a personal essay as well as a reflection on others that you were reporting on, about whether it would be ethical and right to have children. And it struck me as such a profound statement on the state of our world today, that I think a lot about the change that we've gone through, and to get to the point where we're not sure if the changes that we're all experiencing together are manageable enough that we can even sort of continue with the idea of generativity into the future, is really profound. And now you've got sort of AI adding in, getting added into the mix as well. My wife was always stunned by the fact that I like to watch sometimes disaster or horror movies to fall asleep to. And, I've always had to explain to her, look, it's the idea that it could always be worse, that sort of comforts me. But talk about the parts that you think are comforting to people. What is it in the book that you've really made an effort to write as a way of offering hope, offering individual stories that give people an example of how to live? It's really, it illustrates moral courage and gives people a model for that.
I think in a lot of ways, I partly wrote the book to try to find comfort or hope for myself. And I think one of the ways that I find hope is writing, as a journalist, writing stories about people who are just doing incredible work in their communities or in science or, in other areas to try to come up with solutions. There's a couple of different sources of comfort, I think, in the book. And in terms of the emotional piece, one of the things I talk about, the sort of antidote to solastalgia, the idea that we would feel this homesickness about climate change and the impact that it's having on us, is a related concept that the same scholar came up with called soliphilia. And it's the idea that we feel hope and joy and inspiration in coming together in community and coming up with shared solutions. And really, in a lot of ways, that's the theme of the book. You can see it threaded throughout the whole book. People go through different kinds of crises. People, wrestle with really difficult things, and what enables them to get through those is coming together in their community and reinvesting in the places that they love and care about. So, I guess in terms of a couple of examples, one of my favorite stories in the book is about Carleen Anders, who went through major wildfire in her community, and she's a wildland firefighter. And the way that that community was able to recover and rebuild is that they were very tight knit, and they were able to get together and just, kind of do like a collective barn raising, except it was a collective ash clearing and a collective effort to rebuild and clean up the landscape, and then also pause at that moment and think ahead. What does it mean to live in a time when we're going to get more and more of these wildfires? How can we rebuild in ways that our houses are better protected from them? How do we be real about where we are now? And that community has become a model for places across the country that are dealing with the wildfire impacts and are dealing with recovery from disasters, because that's also a set of skills that many people will need to learn, is how do we recover from different kinds of crises than we've had to deal with in the past.
Yeah, I love the concept of solophilia, and I really think that it's just one of many reasons to read this book is to see what you do with that concept. Another concept that you tuck into the book that I'd love for you to talk a little bit about is the one of is that of appropriate technology. So I work on this idea of ethical technology at MIT. I'm here in my capacity as convener for ethical life at MIT's Office of Religious, Spiritual, and Ethical Life, and we're meant to be convening conversations across MIT and here in this case beyond about what it means to live an ethical life in a technological world. And there are those who think that we're going to sort of tech our way out of this problem, whether it's through climate engineering or whatever. There's the scene in Matt Damon's movie where he's on Mars, where he says, we're just going to have to science the shit out of this, right? Forgive my language, Boston Public Library. But you talk a little bit about the idea of appropriate technology in the book. And what does that mean for you? What did it mean in the book? And, what would you like to share with our audience about that?
Appropriate technology is a term that's used, I think, most commonly in sustainable development, especially in developing countries. But it's the idea that you can't just, trot out the latest gee whiz, fancy robotic thing in a place where people are not prepared to adopt that, and it doesn't make any cultural sense, and it's not relevant to the people who are there. The couple places in the book where I think that's very relevant are, one is in Newtok, Alaska. So one of the 4 stories is the story of this community in Alaska that's having to relocate across a river because the village site that they've been living in is literally coming apart. Like the permafrost underneath it is thawing, and there's just much more coastal erosion, and so the land is falling apart. And this is an Alaska Native community. And so they've moved about half of the community now across the water, and they've really become a model for what it means to try to do that, to try to relocate a place en masse and hang on to their cultural traditions. But there's a lot of things about the technology and the way that houses are built that both have to withstand the new pressures of climate change and also the conditions of the Alaskan tundra. And they also have to be culturally relevant. So thinking about how houses are built so that, people remember that as they're building them, multi-generational families will live in them, because that's how people are accustomed to organizing their lives. And developing power and water systems that are simple enough that they work out there on the tundra in the middle of storms. And that community is also looking at things like wind power generation and just much more sustainable, energy efficient buildings that they can use on the landscape out there that free them from having to depend so much on diesel fuel. So there's a lot of hopeful things about that story, but the technology had to be sort of elegant in the way that scientists use that word. It had to be simple and easy to deploy and not outrageously expensive. And I think those are questions that they're still wrestling with. Another place you might think about that is in the book is Richmond, California, which is as I mentioned, a frontline fossil fuel community living alongside a refinery. And, when you talk about making economic transitions and solar power and just building solutions that the community can use, it's really important in a community like that. That's primarily a community of color. It's a community that's had to deal with a lot of both environmental and economic impacts from the fossil fuel industry. And when you think about making transitions in a community like that, you have to make sure that the poorest and the most vulnerable and the people who've often been left out of the economy get a chance to be part of it, because I think that the solutions really won't work. I mean, they'll leave people out, and then they won't have the support of the community, and ethically they won't do the things that we need to have happen in order to solve this crisis. So
yeah, I mean, the Richmond story, which we'll get into more in a second, I believe, is made doubly relevant for this idea of appropriate technology, because these are people who are living on the outskirts of Silicon Valley, of that sort of mythical space that I think of as the Jerusalem of the technology religion in which we are all living. And just a couple hours from them are places where people really do believe, I think, on faith, that if you can build it, you should build it, and especially if you can build it for a profit, you ought to build it. You're obligated to build it. Think of the billions of dollars that you'll make, and then the charitable contributions you'll be able to give. And this idea of appropriate technology, which you sort of, at times you tell about, and at other times you sort of show, is it's a really helpful model to think about when we think, well, is there another way besides the Silicon Valley way? So you want to talk a little bit more about Richmond then? I want to read you just one paragraph of your own writing and have you reflect on it, because this could be Boston, this could be any community in the way that we're either experiencing it or starting to imagine it or fear for it in our minds. So we'll do a little bit more on this particular section, and then we'll start to have a dialogue with our audience, which I'm excited about. So you write, I wondered again, could you really dig into a place like Richmond? Could you really make a home on this tainted patch of earth and asphalt in this moment of possibility and impossibility? This is not separate from the question of surviving climate change. And that little there's so much more in the chapter that I could have pulled out, but I love that idea that, can you make a home there? That's the whole thing in some ways. What do you take from, what were you thinking about when you wrote those particular lines?
There's so many things that I think are threaded through those lines, but I think that places like Richmond have been considered, I mean, you hear the term in the environmental movement, sacrifice zones. And I think that's reflected in a lot of what I talk about in the book about how Richmond even saw itself, how Doria Robinson, whose story I follow through that section, saw her community. It was considered a place you could throw away. And to some degree, growing up there, you felt like you were someone that could be thrown away. And that's very tragic. And when you zoom out into the big picture, for instance, the IPCC, the Major Intergovernmental body that does, publishes scientific research on climate change, has recognized recently that colonialism is a driver of climate change.
Mm.
I think that when you create these places that are sacrifice zones that you can waste, you're creating the space where we can sort of set our problems off in a corner that we don't have to think about. You can not have to deal with the impacts or defer them. And in a lot of ways, that's why we have the fossil fuel economy that we have, and why we haven't dealt with it properly, is that we haven't been real about the impacts. A lot of us who don't live in these communities haven't had to face the direct impacts of them. And I think when you go to a place like that, and when you spend time talking with people, they're much more clear-eyed than a lot of us about what those impacts are. And also, a lot of those communities have really incredible solutions and creativity and innovation that's happening there. And Richmond is one of those places where I think the solutions are coming from the place that's the most impacted. And I wanted people to be able to see and experience that place and know what it's like to deal with those impacts at home.
Yeah, the woman who is your sort of featured character in that last section, her name is Doria Robinson, right? And she really inspired me. I mean, it was one of these people where you brought her to life for me, and I felt like I was getting to know her through you. I was spending time at her house. I was spending time in her work environment, in her community, as she went to meetings, as she met with important people in the community and had good and very bad meetings with them. She's talking to her daughter at one point, I believe, and her daughter says, when I'm your age, I'm going to be living in a refugee camp. Is that right? Did I get the character right? That was her daughter?
Yeah, that's correct. Yeah.
Which reminded me of the context, through which I discovered your work. And I think it's even worth noting, I don't think it's a spoiler. I think it's a teaser for the audience to know that Doria Robinson, who you covered in this way, is now a political leader herself in a way that she absolutely was not. As you were covering her, say a little bit about that. Politics and small town mayors take a big role in your writing. You're fascinated by these characters, and you bring their work to life too.
Yeah, so Doria ran for city council and won in the fall of 2022, and so she's just been sworn in as one of the new city councilors there in Richmond. What's so striking about that is that Richmond for decades was primarily controlled by people who were very supportive of the local oil refinery, which is run by Chevron, which is one of the largest, as a company, is one of the largest emitters of greenhouse gases in the world. And that refinery is one of the largest emitters in California. Chevron funded a lot of the campaigns of the people who won the city council. It was really difficult to voice objections to what the company was doing, even when there were major air pollution concerns for a long time. And then about a decade or so ago, there was a small community coalition that got together, and they formed a political party, and they started running their own candidates who were kind of anti-corporate and progressive and had a lot of different ideas and visions for what the city might be. And that community has gained more and more seats on the city council, and now they have a majority, a pretty sizable majority. And they're talking about making this year kind of a banner year in terms of trying to pass model laws and legislation that, and not legislation, I should say, at a local level, but I mean, they're trying to pass local laws that could be a model for a lot of cities dealing with things like fossil fuels and climate crisis, and creating new kinds of economic opportunities for people. So it's super exciting, and it's a really fascinating story and journey, an example of what can happen at the local level. And now we have this federal legislation, the Inflation Reduction Act. So a place like Richmond could have a big role, their local leaders could have a big role in how that kind of a program unrolls, and who gets to take advantage of it, and what ways that a place could be re-envisioned. So it's really exciting.
Yeah, I would think that if there are political junkies on this in this audience, as I'm sure there are, that one of the benefits of reading the book is you really get a much more nuanced and detailed sense of what that Inflation Reduction Act could mean in this country and what it should mean. I imagine that's what you were thinking as you saw that legislation rolled out.
Yeah, I mean, of course, it passed after the book came out, but I think that. So I was just on a call with Bill McKibben recently, earlier this month, and he
says that your book is marvelous and actually
anyway, Bill was talking about the Inflation Reduction Act. He just wrote an excellent piece on it in the New Yorker, which everybody should go check out. But he was articulating something that I think is also probably apparent in the stories in the book, which is that a lot of the transitions that have to happen economically in terms of, getting heat pumps across the country and electrifying houses and really changing the way that Americans live and run their homes has to happen on a community by community basis, because it needs to be organized in a sort of larger way than just house by house. And so a lot of the organizing, a lot of the work on that is going to happen in little places like Richmond and like, perhaps St. Augustine, or, the little towns that, and cities like Boston that are trying to figure out how to, make this program their own and roll it out. So.
Yeah, like I said, I think if you read at home on An Unruly Planet, you will gain insight into that process. All right, in a second, I'm going to turn to some audience questions. But I thought I would just take a minute and before doing that, I want to give a plug, and nobody asked me to do this particularly other than just to mention it. But I really want to give a serious plug to the book selling co-sponsor of the event, Porter Square Books. I would love for members of the audience and their friends to go and buy this book at home on An Unruly Planet, Finding Refuge on a Changed Earth. And I really would love you to buy it at Porter Square Books. It's just my favorite local bookstore. They're not too far from where I live. They've got a Cambridge location and a Boston location now. I just do like all my online ordering of books, like what I used to do on Amazon. I go to their website and I just spend like, I don't know, a couple $1,000s a year, if not more at Porter Square Books. So, I'm paying them to give this plug, but they're so thoughtful about what they keep in stock, the way that they set the bookstore up, the way that you feel even on their website like you're interacting with like an actual group of humans that has a creative model of how to share revenues and cooperative decision making at the bookstore. It's a great place. So just go buy the book and buy it there, Porter Square Books. So all right, we've got a couple of really good questions already. And then this is time to put yours in there if you want to get it in before we finish up. As an Episcopal priest, one question asker writes, who works on climate change for 2 dioceses in Massachusetts and for the United Church of Christ in Southern New England, I'd be interested in discussion of the roles that communities of faith should be playing in a climate emergency. And that's relevant to me as well. I do interfaith work and I work with these sorts of communities all the time, as well as playing a facilitating role in myself. So what do you think about this? What would you advise communities like ours to do, to think about, to get involved with, to learn about?
I mean, there's a lot of different ways that faith communities, I think, could get involved in this. So one of the more interesting models is Interfaith Power and Light, which has organized community solar projects and solar panels on church rooftops all across the country, and they have a big network and they're amazing. I think also, another book that you might check out, I mentioned Bill McKibben, but his latest book, The Flag, the Cross, and the Station Wagon, talks a lot about the role of faith communities across the country and what they could be and what they have been in ways both good and bad. But I one thing that faith communities are actively involved in right now, and I saw a lot of it on the ground when I was reporting this book, is disaster response. So there's huge networks of disaster response, but I think that faith communities could probably think a lot more proactively about how they're going to help people find resilience and recover and deal with these new disasters that we're facing, and also perhaps be a resource to people. I mean, as I alluded to multiple times, we have these new federal programs that are going to help people make big transitions in their homes, but a lot of people don't have the wherewithal to. I mean, I think about what it means just when I have to replumb something in my house and what a huge ordeal that is. I think that if people can get together in communities, including in faith communities, and figure out how together to make some of those transitions and be a resource to each other, that could be amazing.
Yeah, I mean, and I'll add, I think they could consider reading the book in their groups. It has a sort of Bible study feel to it. And I mean, it's probably a sacrilegious thing for me to say. I say sacrilegious things for a living, so forgive me. But the idea is in the Bible studies that I've been a part of, you read for the literature, you read for the characters, you read for the messages, and for the sense of, well, what do I do about this in my own life? And that's what the book that's what your book, Madeline, is meant for. How can individuals and small groups affect the climate outcome? What do you say to somebody who asks that question? I think it's a question that can be born out of hope. It can also, I'm projecting here, be born out of some despair, the sense of I'm so small, what can I do? Your book is in many ways a response to that question, but as the author, answering in a brief way, what's your response?
One of the reasons I decided to focus on community in the book is because I think it's a scale at which we both can feel powerful, and also it feels manageable. So it feels often quite difficult to influence the federal picture. And I'm not saying that at all. I think that the activism to influence, federal and national, federal and international politics is incredibly important. All of those climate strikes are incredibly important. And also there's a lot that can happen at the scale of home and community. So one study that I like to cite appeared a couple of years ago in Nature Communications, and they put together all of the different climate commitments across the country from state and local and business groups, and found that it could basically meet about half of the emissions cuts that we need to make by 2030. And if you gave it a little push, it could meet even more of that by itself. And then if you add in, if we keep ramping that up, I mean, that's a big deal. That's a lot of the puzzle that we need to put together. So I think that people can do a lot at the scale of community. I think at the scale of the individual, it's more challenging. I think that there are individual actions that are important and worth taking, but I think they're generally more worth taking if you're doing it with others, and it feels less isolating and less tiny if you do it that way.
It's a call to take part in community, which is often very difficult to do. Communities are not perfect, but they are increasingly important, or we're increasingly rediscovering their importance. Maybe. Meg asks, what ideas do residents have to accept in order to leave the water's edge rather than trying to adapt buildings?
That's an interesting question, and I think it depends on the place. So there are places where it perhaps makes sense, at least for the time being, to say, let the water in. So one adaptation strategy is that some places have done is make the first floor, able to tolerate flooding rushing in. And some places that may be appropriate, and in other places people really need to relocate right away. I think in some places it's, I talk about a community in New York that has done this. In some places it's actually been a very thoughtful process of a community getting together and saying, we want to let this place go collectively. New Talk is like that as well. I think it probably has to happen in a deliberate way that people understand and feel empowered and feel like they're not being forced off of something for there to be that kind of local support. And I'm not going to say that it's going to be easy, but it's going to have to happen in a lot of places, that people have to be real about the risks that they face, and, you know, be able to see that it makes sense for them to leave those places behind.
Great. Rachel Mullis asks a few interesting questions. I'll pull out a couple of them. She says, you write so beautifully about people who are reclaiming their homes and learning to live with change. Still, climate change refugees are going to be a reality and already are. Do you have thoughts on how comparatively stable communities can better plan for and embrace displaced communities?
Wow. There's a great book by Gaia Vince that is about, it's called Nomad Century, and it's about the refugee crisis. I mean, I guess I allude to some of this in one of the chapters where I talk about the work of bell hooks. I think that when we think about the concept of home, if we get too insular, it gets kind of dangerous, because we're in a place and a time when we are going to need to be more, I don't know, capacious is the word that comes to my mind about what home means, or, you know, that home is about organizing something collectively for our combined resilience and survival. And I mean, I think one of the things that has to happen on an international level is that we don't even really recognize climate refugees as a category. It's not an official legal category anywhere. So I think that one of the things that needs to happen on a policy level is we need to get real about the fact that this is happening. We're going to have more and more climate refugees, and they are a real thing, and we need policies and planning to try to manage that crisis.
Tom asks, what about things that are starting to not happen as a result of climate change? For example, you know, we haven't had much winter yet in New England this year, just a little. Maple syrup production, he says, will slowly move north. Lobstering already has, he says. Can you talk a little bit about how things that disappear gradually rather than happening dramatically also affect people and their communities? Yeah, these sort of small changes that a region is not what it once was. What is it becoming? What do you think about that?
I think that gets to some of the solastalgia idea that we talked about. And not just say that those losses are purely emotional. Obviously, losing maple syrup production is going to be economic as well, but it's cultural. And I think those feelings of loss are things that we have to reckon with, and we have to reckon with collectively. I was talking to a scholar in the UK about how, as with so many things in our culture, we think of grief and loss as being an individual thing. We think that you sit at home by yourself and feel your feelings, but in fact, across most cultures, historically, and still now, grief is a shared process that people get together and they process together. And so perhaps we need to think more about how we're processing climate grief together, and perhaps talking about those losses might lead to different kinds of solutions and lead people to be more realistic about what we're facing and what kinds of changes we need to make.
Helen asks, and yet global emissions continue to rise. How do you integrate emotionally and strategically inspiring work at the community level with the reality of the enduring power of fossil fuel interests? And to that, I'll add, and how do we deal with our anger about it?
Well, anger can be really useful. I think moral outrage is a lot of what's driving, for instance, the school climate strikes across the world, which have been very powerful in getting a message across. I mean, there are signs of hope. While emissions are still rising, solar is outpacing coal now, but Yeah, it's scary. It's scary for me as a person who writes about the climate crisis. Um, I think that what I have taken inspiration from is watching the people whose stories that I write about in the book. I think there's a form of hope that isn't about necessarily a guaranteed outcome or about knowing what's going to happen, but about just looking around you and digging in and saying, there's work that has to be done here. There are people that I have to help around me. There are things that need to be done. And I think that that's actually the kind of work that ultimately has the most promise of making the kinds of transitions that we need to make. When we were reflecting on Dory Robinson, she has moments of despair, lots of them, and I reflect on them in the book, but she also just looks at her community and says, I want to do as much as I can to protect the people that I love. I want to do as much as I can to make this place beautiful, to imagine that it could be something else. And I think having that sense of love for a place and of care for the people around you and a sense of mission and vision is what's going to move us forward. I think that we all need a dose of that as we're engaging in these projects, even though we have no guarantees ever that it's going to all work out. I think it's a fight worth fighting.
I'll throw a quick Boston one in there for you. So we brought you to discuss this at MIT, beautiful discussion that we had with the Night Science journalists a few months ago. And as part of that, you and I had a chance to stop in for a few moments to Greentown Labs, this big place in Somerville, my neighborhood, where they're pioneering different kinds of green tech. But of course, we saw that what was it, Chevron and Shell, I believe, are the sort of big sponsors, the first two sponsors on the wall as one walks in. And just a few weeks later, I don't know if you noticed that Prince William and Kate were visitors to the exact same place. What do you think about when you think about places like that? What does it come? What comes to your mind as you see a place like that, or as you see somebody like a Prince of England drawing such attention to that sort of work, given what you've done, knowing what you know?
Oh, wow. I mean, we could spend another hour just talking about that. I think if you look at the Richmond story in the book, it does get very complicated when the big industry group that has its own interests tries to get involved in things like philanthropy. I think it can go badly for a lot of communities. I think, unfortunately, a lot of the industries that are most polluting have, done a lot of very bad faith things when it comes to the climate crisis. There's a lot of reporting on this. Inside Climate News has revealed a lot of things about basically the ways that these companies haven't told the truth. So I'm fairly skeptical about the idea that a wonderful green solution could be funded by Chevron. I mean, I don't want to pass judgment on a group that, takes that money and feels they could do things they wouldn't be able to with that kind of funding. But I think it is kind of challenging in the sort of political climate that we have right now.
Yeah, at the very least, maybe the answer is not going to just come from Chevron funding. It's going to have to come from grassroots community efforts as well. I think is something that resonates with me. All right, well, we've got time for you to either make a closing comment or make a final read us a final line or few. I'll note that Rachel asks the question, now that the book is out, what's next? What big ideas are you weighing as you look forward?
I'll answer that super quick, and then I'll read you a couple of paragraphs that are from the second Richmond chapter that I think sum up what we've been talking about. So I am looking at doing a series of stories about the kinds of transitions that are happening across the country as a result of the Inflation Reduction Act, and that's really closely connected with what's in the book. I'm also interested in questions about what we do with these places like Richmond that have been dominated by fossil fuels. If we're going to make a transition, places like Philadelphia, for instance, where massive refineries shut down in the last couple of years. If we're going to make a transition, we're going to have to figure out what to do with those big old facilities and how we reckon with those landscapes and clean them up. So I'm going to read you a couple of paragraphs. This is straight out of the book, so I will not have introduced any typos into it this time. This is toward the end of the second chapter on Richmond, and it kind of sums up my thoughts and feelings. I have taken one main lesson from observing the struggles of Richmond and other communities like it. We think of power as belonging only to a select few, those who rule the world and those who own most of the wealth. But there is a kind of power that grows from the ground around you. Power can come from community. Power can come from home, from knowing that we belong to a place and a planet. And it is our collective job to grow something useful here and to create space for the generations that come after us. Enormous radical solutions are necessary to remedy the climate crisis. Big policies, big ideas, big economic shifts. So far, the rulers and the billionaires haven't been leading us toward anything that will realistically keep us from catastrophe. So far, many of the most ambitious strides have come from the grassroots, from the marchers and protesters, the small town mayors, the artists and teachers and musicians, the firefighters and farmers and scientists, the people who have their hands in the dirt, the people who are able to reimagine how to live. Here, in the smallest places, there are big transformations that could reverberate and ripple around the world, especially if we decided as a society to nourish such efforts, to lend our own energy to them, to dig in.
Thank you so much, Madeline. Thank you, Greg, for your sharing your conversation with us here tonight. And for those who will be watching the video later, as a reminder, you can get your copy of At Home on an Unruly Planet from our bookstore partner for tonight's program, Porter Square Books, or check your local public library. Details will be included in the chat again. This year, the Boston Public Library's programmatic theme is You Are Here, Climate Change and What to Do About It. So tonight's talk really kicked things off along those lines. You can find out more about resources, services, and programs for people of all ages at your local branch, or visit us at bpl.org. On behalf of the Boston Public Library and our program partners for this evening, thank you all for joining us, and we hope to see you soon at another author talk or another program. Thank you and take care. Good night.